The message arrived on a Tuesday. Not a cry for help, not a declaration of war, not even a warning, just a notice, clean, polite, and filed through the proper channels with every required stamp and signature attached. It reached the Galactic Council's main communication tower at exactly 6:04 in the morning, station time. The duty officer on shift was a young Prothean named Arvel who had never handled anything more serious than a misfiled trade report. He read the message once, then again. Then he sat very still for about 30 seconds and called his supervisor. His supervisor called her supervisor. Within 2 hours, the entire Galactic Council had been woken up. The message was short.
Hi guys, welcome back to my YouTube channel, Sci-Fi HFY Stories. Please don't forget like, comment and share this video. Thank you.
To the Galactic Council and all signatory species of the Treaty of Solus IV, this notice confirms that the period of isolation agreed upon in Article 9 of the said treaty has now reached its end. The human species will be resuming full participation in galactic trade, travel, and diplomacy, effective from the date above. All outstanding obligations under the treaty will be settled in full at the scheduled summit. We thank the Council for its patience and look forward to a productive meeting. Signed, Ambassador Vera Solis, representative of Earth and its territories. That was it. No anger, no threats, no list of grievances, not a single word about what 100 years of forced isolation had felt like. Just a date, a location, a polite thank you, and a signature. High Arbiter Sorvith read it 5 times. He was the oldest member of the council, 712 years old, which was young for a Zelthari but ancient by the standards of most other species. He had seen wars begin. He had seen civilizations collapse. He had watched proud empires write their final, desperate messages to anyone who would listen. He had read thousands of documents in his long life, and he knew, the way a person knows the smell of rain before it starts, when a piece of writing was hiding something. This one was hiding nothing. That was the problem. The emergency session of the Galactic Council began at noon. The chamber was a wide, circular room with high ceilings and walls made of pale stone that had been cut from a moon that no longer existed. 40 seats arranged in a half circle, each one built to fit a different body shape, a different number of limbs, a different way of sitting. Most of them were full. Ambassador Dreth of the Kavari arrived still fixing his formal collar. Ambassador Sela of the Prothean Union came in with a data tablet in each hand, already reading. The Velari delegation sent 3 representatives instead of the usual one, which told Sorvith something about how frightened they already were. Sorvith let them settle, then he read the message aloud. The room was quiet when he finished. Then everyone spoke at once. He let them talk for a few minutes. Complaints about being woken early. Questions about whether the message was genuine. One ambassador, the representative from the Mall Collective, a species that communicated mostly through color shifts in their skin, turned a deep, anxious orange that meant something between this is a disaster, and I told you this would happen. Sorvith raised one hand. They stopped. The message is genuine, he said. The signature matches. The certification codes are correct. The filing is in order. Every single procedural requirement has been met perfectly, I might add. A pause. They filed this notice 6 months in advance. They were not required to. The treaty only asks for 30 days. Ambassador Dreth frowned. So they gave us extra time, that's considerate. Yes, said Sorvith, it is. The way he said it made Dreth stop frowning and start looking worried instead. The original Treaty of Solus IV had been signed 100 years ago, in this very chamber, at this very table. It had not been a proud moment for anyone, or at least, it should not have been. Humanity had made an error, a serious one, a diplomatic mistake so large and so public that it had damaged relationships between 6 different species and nearly triggered a small war. The details were still debated by historians. What was not debated was the result. The Galactic Council had decided that humanity needed to be separated from the wider galaxy for a period of time. 100 years. They would keep their home system. They would keep their planet, their moon, their immediate space. But all travel beyond a certain boundary was forbidden. All trade with other species was suspended. All communication was limited to official channels only. The humans had not been happy about it. But they had signed. And tucked into Article 9, subsection 3, buried in the legal language that nobody really reads carefully at the time, was a small clause about reparations. The humans owed certain payments to certain species for the damage caused. Those payments would be made with interest at the end of the isolation period. The interest rate was 3.7% per year, compounding annually. It had seemed like a reasonable number at the time. Standard, ordinary, the kind of rate you attach to a fine and forget about. That was 100 years ago. Sorvith watched the faces in the room as the council's chief economist, a small, precise Vorathi named Calcise, stood up to present the preliminary numbers. Calcise was not a dramatic person. She did not gesture when she spoke. She did not raise her voice. She simply placed the figures on the shared display in the center of the room, stood back and waited. The room looked at the numbers. The room went very quiet. The orange of the Mall ambassador's skin deepened to something close to red. "That," said Ambassador Sela, setting down both her tablets, "cannot be correct." "It is correct," said Calcise. "I checked it 4 times. The compounding has been running for 100 years on the original reparation total, the current figure." "I can see the current figure," said Sela. "The current figure is what the treaty requires us to receive," said Sorvith carefully. "The humans are not asking for more than what the treaty says. They are asking for exactly what the treaty says." "Silence." "We wrote that clause," said Dreth slowly. "Yes," said Sorvith. "We wrote it as it was supposed to be a formality. It was never meant to." "I know what it was meant to be," said Sorvith. He looked at the number on the display for a moment, just a moment. Then he looked away. After the session ended and the chamber emptied, Sorvith sat alone at the long stone table. His aide brought him the preliminary report on humanity's current status, the first real intelligence they had managed to pull together in the 6 hours since the message arrived. Sorvith picked it up, read the first page, set it face down on the table. He did not pick it up again for a long time. Outside the council station's main viewport, the galaxy looked the same as it always had. Stars, cold and distant and indifferent. Trade lanes marked in soft blue light on the nav charts. Species moving around each other in the careful, negotiated dance that kept the peace most of the time. In 3 months, a human diplomatic transport would dock at this station. And everything that the galaxy had assumed about that meeting, everything that Sorvith and Dreth and Sela and every other ambassador had assumed, was already wrong. They just didn't know it yet. One thing Sorvith did know, as he sat alone in that quiet room with the face-down report and the very large number still glowing on the display. Humanity had spent 100 years inside one star system. They had not complained. They had not begged. They had not sent angry messages or tried to break the agreement. They had simply said fine. And then they had gone home. And done something. What Sorvith thought, does a species do with 100 years and nothing to lose? He didn't want to read the rest of the report. He read it anyway. He was still sitting at the table 3 hours later when his aide came to tell him it was time for dinner. He said he wasn't hungry. He was telling the truth. Commander Jan had spent 31 years classifying things. That was his job, his talent, the thing he was better at than almost anyone in the Galactic Watch. A ship entered a scanner range and within 30 seconds Jan could tell you what it was, where it was from, what it was carrying, and whether it was going to be a problem. He could read a fleet formation the way other people read a face, the small details that nobody else noticed, the things that told you the real story before anyone opened their mouth. He had cataloged over 1,000 different fleet configurations in his career. War fleets had a look to them, weapons arrays built into the hulls like arguments. The geometry was aggressive, everything pointed outward, everything said stay back. Merchant convoys traveled loose and a little messy. The ships spread out like they were already tired and just wanted to get where they were going. Colony ships moved slow and careful, heavy with everything a species thought it might need to start over somewhere new. What came out of the soulless corridor 6 weeks before the summit was none of these. 300 ships. Jan watched them emerge one by one on his display, and he felt a small, uncomfortable thing happening in the back of his mind. The thing that happened when a puzzle piece didn't fit, but you kept trying to push it in anyway. The formation was wrong for combat. There were no weapons arrays that his scanners could identify, or rather, there were some, but they were small, almost casual, the kind of defensive systems you put on a ship the same way you put a lock on a door. Not because you expect trouble, just because it would be strange not to. The formation was wrong for transport too. Transport convoys spread out. These ships held a tight, specific geometry, not aggressive, not defensive. Efficient. Like they had been arranged by someone who was thinking about fuel consumption and travel time, not about what to do if someone tried to shoot at them. The energy signatures were the part that made Jan call his senior analyst and ask her to run the scan again. She ran it again. Same result. Industrial, she said, the word coming out slow like she was testing it. The signatures read as industrial, manufacturing output mostly, some research, power generation on a level that's, she paused. Sir, the power generation readings on some of these vessels are larger than most planetary grids. Jan stared at the display for a long moment. They're not warships, he said. No, sir. They're not transports. Not exactly, no. Then what are they? His analyst looked at her screen, then at him. The expression on her face was one Jan had never seen on her before, and he had worked with her for 9 years. I don't have a category for them, she said. He watched the fleet for 6 hours. It moved at a steady, unhurried pace. It did not change formation. It did not scan them back in any aggressive way, though Jan was certain they knew they were being watched. The lead ship sent a single communication, a standard identification packet, properly formatted, containing the name of the fleet, its registered purpose, diplomatic escort and support, and a polite note that it would be holding at a safe distance from all inhabited stations until the scheduled summit date. Polite, correctly filed, perfectly on schedule. Jan wrote his report. He used the phrase unclassified formation in the summary because unprecedented felt like giving too much away, and unknown felt like admitting a failure he wasn't ready to admit. He sent the report to the council. Then he sat back and kept watching. One of his junior officers was a 22-year-old Kavari named Tev. Fresh out of the academy, still a little too eager, the kind of person who asked questions that senior officers had learned to stop asking because the answers were usually uncomfortable. Tev watched the fleet on his screen for an hour without saying anything. Then he said, "Sir, what did they do?" Jan didn't look away from his own screen. What? The humans for 100 years in there. Tev gestured vaguely toward the soulless region. What did they do with all that time? It was a simple question. It was the question that nobody in the Galactic Watch had thought to ask until right now, 6 weeks before the summit, watching 300 unclassifiable ships hold a perfect formation in the dark. Jan had no answer. He pulled up the last known census data for humanity, 100 years old. The population figure was large but not remarkable, roughly average for a mid-sized species with a single home system. He ran a standard population growth projection forward 100 years, using normal figures, nothing dramatic. He looked at the result. He ran it again. "Tev," he said. "Sorry. Find me the most recent data we have on the human home system. Anything. Atmospheric readings, energy output, trade rumors from before the isolation, anything that might tell us about infrastructure development." Tev moved fast. He was good at this part, the research. He came back in 20 minutes with a thin file, not much, because there hadn't been much contact in a long time, but enough. Energy output readings taken by passing survey vessels over the decades. Gravitational anomalies logged by automated beacons. A few old reports from the very start of the isolation period, filed by the monitoring stations before they were pulled back. Jan read through it carefully. Then he read it again. Each data point was small. Each one alone meant nothing. But together, in order, year by year, they told a story. A quiet story. A patient one. The energy readings in the human system had grown. Slowly at first, then faster. The gravitational readings suggested construction on a scale that the old monitoring stations had not been designed to detect. The asteroid fields in their home system had, according to the survey data, changed shape over 50 years. You didn't change the shape of an asteroid field by accident. You did it by mining it. All of it. Jan sent a second message to the council. It was longer than the first one. He was not normally a writer who used many words, but this one needed them. He explained what he had found. He explained what he thought it meant. He ended the message with a line that he rewrote 4 times before he was satisfied. "The fleet is not the concern. The fleet is what they chose to show us. The concern is what we cannot see." He received a reply from Sorvith's office within the hour. "Understood. Continue monitoring. Prepare full dossier for summit briefing." That was all. Jan understood. There was nothing else to say. The summit was 6 weeks away. The notice had been filed. The treaty was clear. The humans were coming and they had every legal right to come. Everything was in order. That was the problem. In 31 years of service, Jan had learned that things which were completely in order, every document signed, every procedure followed, every courtesy observed, were sometimes the most dangerous things of all, because there was nothing to push against. No rule being broken. No line being crossed. Just a polite species on a legal course, moving at a steady speed, holding a formation that had no name, toward a meeting they had been patient enough to wait 100 years for. He looked at the fleet on his display. 300 ships, quiet still. "Tev," he said. "Sorry. Get some sleep. Tomorrow we start the full dossier." Tev nodded and left. Jan stayed. He watched the fleet until his next shift started. He watched it the way you watch a door you are not sure is locked, not with panic, not with certainty. With the specific, uncomfortable feeling of a man who is very good at his job, realizing that his job just got larger. The dossier arrived at the council chamber 2 weeks before the summit. It was 411 pages long. Commander Jan's team had worked without breaks to put it together, pulling every piece of data they could find. Old survey readings, monitoring logs, intercepted signals, trade records from the early years of isolation, atmospheric scans, gravitational data, energy output figures, and organized it all in order, year by year, across a full century. High Arbiter Sorvith received his copy at 7 in the morning. He read it straight through without stopping. He finished at noon. Then he sat in his chair and did not move for a long time. Year 7 of the isolation. A small note in an old survey log, filed by an automated beacon that nobody had checked in decades. The human home system had completed what appeared to be a closed-loop resource cycle, all manufacturing waste being recaptured and reused. No raw materials imported because there were none to import. No waste being dumped into space because they could not afford to waste anything. The Prothean analyst who wrote the summary note on this section had added a single line in brackets. No other species in recorded galactic history has achieved a fully closed resource loop in under 10 years. The standard benchmark is 40 to 60 years with external support. Sorvith turned the page. Year 14. Construction. The first major expansion of their orbital infrastructure. The survey beacon data showed new gravitational signatures above their planet, large structures, multiple, growing fast. The energy output of the home system increased by a factor of 3 in 18 months. They were building. Year 19. The first generation born entirely under the isolation. Children who had never seen a ship from another species. Young people who had grown up knowing only one star, one planet, one set of borders they were not allowed to cross. Historians in the Prothean Intelligence Division had managed to recover some cultural records from this period: old broadcasts, archived educational materials, fragments of music and art. The analyst noted something strange. These children were not angry. They were curious. In their schools, other species were a subject of intense study, not with resentment, not with bitterness, with the focused, patient attention of people who intend to be ready when the time comes. They studied galactic languages, trade systems, political structures, the histories of every major species. They studied the treaty. They studied Article 9. They calculated, as a standard school exercise in their mathematics classes, the compound interest on the reparation figure. They knew the number. They taught it to their children like a fact of nature, like the distance from their planet to their sun, or the length of their year. The number was not a wound. It was a goal. Year 26. This was the page that made Ambassador Dreth, reading his copy in his office on the other side of the station, stand up from his desk and walk to his window and stand there looking at the stars for several minutes before he could sit back down again. The human species had begun extracting materials from their asteroid belt in a serious way. Not exploration, not sampling, extraction on a massive scale, using methods the galactic community had developed over centuries and which humanity appeared to have independently arrived at in under 3 decades. The shape of the asteroid belt changed. Year after year, the survey data showed it shrinking, getting lighter, getting thinner, and the energy readings in the home system kept growing. They were feeding it all back into construction. Year 34. The technology breakthrough that the Prothean analyst had flagged in red at the top of the page, with a note that said simply, "Please see attached technical summary." Fold compression drive technology, the method that allowed ships to travel vast distances in a fraction of normal time. The Zelthari had developed it over 3 centuries. The Kavari had purchased the schematics and spent 50 years adapting it to their own ships. Humanity had worked it out in 34 years. On their own. With no access to any outside research. No trade of information. No contact with any species that used the technology. They had started from old records of how galactic ships moved and worked backward from observation to theory to engineering in 34 years, because they needed it and they had nothing better to do. The technical summary was attached. It was 60 pages long. It was, according to Jan's engineering consultants, correct in every detail. Not similar to the standard design. Better than the standard design in 3 specific areas. Year 67. The population figures. Nobody on the council read this page without stopping. The human population at the start of the isolation had been large but unremarkable. 1 planet, 1 moon colony, a few small orbital stations. Standard numbers for a species of their age and development level. 100 years had passed. They had not been able to spread to new systems. They had not been able to trade or receive outside resources. Everything they had grown themselves from what was already inside those borders. The number on the page was not standard anymore. It was the result of a species that had turned inward with complete focus, that had built habitats and stations and orbital platforms and underground cities and moon colonies and space stations, and every other kind of place a person could live, because there was nowhere else to go and no ceiling on how many places you could build in a space you already owned. Sorvith looked at the number. He thought about the 300 ships in Jan's fleet report. He understood for the first time why those ships were so large. Somewhere in the middle of the dossier, buried between economic modeling charts, was a short cultural note that Jan had flagged as possibly relevant, purpose unclear. During the isolation decades, a phrase had entered common use in human speech. It appeared in personal letters, in public broadcasts, in engineering logs, in military training records, in children's books, in the graduation speeches of their academies. We'll settle it properly. Nobody had said this to the council. Nobody had sent it in any message. It was just something they said to each other inside their borders in the dark. A reminder, a habit, the kind of phrase that starts as something one person says and becomes, over time, something a whole species carries around without thinking about it. We'll settle it properly. The Prothean analyst who found it had added a note. Sentiment appears to refer to the treaty obligations and eventual return to galactic contact. Emotional tone is difficult to classify, does not read as vengeful, reads more like a person who intends to finish a job correctly. Sorvith closed the dossier. He thought about the message Arvel had received on that Tuesday morning, the clean, polite notice, the 6 months of advance filing, the correct signatures, the perfect procedure. He thought about 100 years of children doing math in school to calculate a compound interest number, and treating it not as punishment, but as homework. He thought about an asteroid belt that had been quietly eaten and turned into ships. He thought about the phrase "we'll settle it properly" and the specific tone of it, not anger, not threat, just the calm intention of someone who has never once considered not following through. They were always going to come back, he said quietly to the empty room. The empty room did not disagree. He called his aide and asked for the summit schedule. Then he asked for the full legal text of the Treaty of Solus IV, specifically Article 9, every subsection. Then he asked for something he had not asked for in a long time. A calculator. He wanted to run the compound interest number himself. He didn't want to be surprised when she put it on the table. He already knew, with the deep certainty of a 700-year-old diplomat who had made very few mistakes and was starring at one of them, that the human ambassador would not be surprised by anything in that room. She had been ready for this meeting for 100 years. The galaxy had 2 weeks. The summit station had seen many important meetings. Wars had been stopped in this building, treaties signed, borders drawn and redrawn. Some of the most powerful figures in the galaxy had walked these corridors and sat in these rooms and said things that changed the shape of history. In all those years, in all those meetings, the station staff had learned to read the atmosphere of an important day. You could feel it in how people moved faster, quieter, with the compressed energy of those who understand that something large is about to happen. The day Ambassador Vera Solis arrived, the whole station felt like a held breath. She came alone. That was the first thing that made the waiting ambassadors uneasy. Every other major delegation had arrived with advisors, security personnel, legal experts, assistants carrying data tablets and equipment cases. The Velari had brought 16 people. The Kavari, 22. Sorvith himself had an aide on each side and a legal team of 7 waiting in the anteroom. Vera Solis walked off the docking ramp with one aide and a briefcase. The briefcase was old, real leather, worn at the corners with a brass clasp that caught the station lights as she walked. It was the kind of object that belonged in a history display, not a diplomatic summit. The station security officer moved forward automatically, the way they did with all new arrivals, reaching toward the bag. Vera stopped, smiled, a calm, unhurried smile, the kind that had nothing to prove. "It's just paper," she said. The security officer looked at the briefcase, looked at her, stepped back. She walked through to the main corridor. Commander Jan, watching from the security monitoring room, leaned forward slightly toward his screen. He had read the full dossier twice. He knew the numbers, the fleet data, the population figures, the technology assessments. He had spent 2 weeks building a picture of what humanity had become during a century of silence. And the thing that walked off that ship was a small woman in her late 50s with a leather briefcase and sensible shoes. Tev was standing behind him. "She doesn't look dangerous," Tev said. "No," said Jan. He watched her greet Sorvith's protocol officer with a small nod, accept a station guide, and follow the escort toward the main chamber. "That's the problem," he said. The chamber seated 40 species. Every seat was filled. Sorvith took his place at the head of the curved table and watched the room settle. He had chosen the seating arrangements carefully, giving each delegation the position that best fit their comfort and status. He had done everything correctly. The food and water on the table reflected the dietary needs of every species present. The translation systems had been tested 3 times. He had controlled every detail he could control. Vera Solis sat down across from all of them, one small, still figure at a long table, and put the briefcase on the surface in front of her. Her aide sat one step behind, hands folded, quiet. Sorvith opened the session with the full formal welcome. It took 12 minutes. He used every part of the traditional ceremony, every phrase and acknowledgement. He was buying time and he knew it, and he suspected she knew it too, but ceremony was ceremony, and it was all he had left to offer. She listened without moving, without looking impatient, without looking bored. She simply listened the way a person listens who has been patient for a very long time and has learned that time does not frighten them. When he finished, she thanked him. 2 sentences. Then she opened the briefcase. The paper was real. Actual physical paper, 100 years old, some of it, the old documents preserved in protective sleeves. The new ones were fresh and white and crisp. She removed them all and arranged them on the table with both hands, precise and neat, the way a person arranges things when they have done this in their head so many times that the physical act is almost automatic. The top document was the original treaty of Solus IV. Most of the ambassadors recognized it. Several had seen copies. A few had been briefed on its exact contents in the last 2 weeks. The Mall ambassador's skin shifted through several colors quickly before settling on a deep, unhappy blue. Vera placed it on the table and did not say anything about it. Below it she placed a ledger. That was the only word for it. An actual written ledger, columns of figures on page after page, a complete accounting of every year of compounding interest, every calculation, every figure, starting from the original reparation amount on day 1 of the isolation, and ending at the exact total owed as of this morning. Below that she placed a stack of transfer confirmations, one for each signatory species, each one showing a completed transaction, the exact amount owed in the preferred currency equivalent of the receiving species, already transferred, already cleared, already done. Before she had walked into the room, before she had sat down, before the ceremony, before the welcome speech, before any of it, the debt had already been paid. She slid the full stack across the table toward Sorvith with both hands. The gesture was formal, old. the specific movement of someone who has fulfilled an obligation and is presenting the proof. The debt is settled, she said, in full with interest as agreed. The chamber was completely silent. Sorvith looked at the documents. He did not touch them yet. He looked at the transfer confirmations, each one in a different currency, each one showing a cleared balance, each one time-stamped to 6:40 this morning, the exact same minute the summit session had been scheduled to begin. Not a minute early, not a minute late. On time, he thought, of course. He looked up at her. She was watching him with an expression that was not triumphant, not cold, not angry. It was the expression of someone who has finished a long job and is simply waiting to see what comes next. Patient, settled, completely, infuriatingly calm. "The debt is received," he said, because the ceremony required it, and the words tasted strange in his mouth. "Thank you," she said. A pause. The whole room leaned forward slightly, without meaning to. Vera reached into the briefcase again. "Shall we discuss the next item?" She placed a second document on the table. It was thinner than the first stack. Clean white paper, fresh, new. She did not slide it across. She set it in the center of the table and left it there between them. New terms. 2 words at the top of the page, in every language of every species in the room. Sorvith looked at the document. He had known this was coming. He had known since he read the dossier, since he ran the numbers himself, since he understood, fully and finally, that the century of isolation had not weakened humanity the way everyone had assumed it would. They had assumed hunger, desperation, a species that would come crawling back, grateful for any arrangement, willing to accept lesser terms than before just to be welcomed into the galaxy again. What sat across the table from him was not desperate. What sat across the table from him had a fleet of 300 ships in the dark, a population nobody had expected, technology that had improved in a closed box for 100 years, and a briefcase full of paperwork that had been prepared with the kind of care that only comes from a very long time of planning. "What do you want?" he asked, quietly, carefully. Vera looked at him across the table. For just a moment, less than a second, something moved in her eyes. Something old and tired and not angry, but not entirely without pain either. "The same thing we wanted before," she said. "A seed." The document sat on the table between them. Nobody had touched it yet. Outside the viewport behind Sorvith's head, the human fleet sat in the dark at a respectful distance, not advancing, not posturing, not doing anything at all except being there, solid, patient, enormous, and completely, perfectly still. The new terms were not what anyone had expected. 31 species signed by the end of the first day. Not because they were forced to. Not because the humans had threatened anyone or positioned a fleet in a hostile way or sent a single aggressive message. They signed because when Ambassador Sela of the Prothean Union finally picked up the document and read through it in full, she looked up with an expression that Sorvith had never seen on her before, the expression of someone who has been prepared for a punch and received a handshake instead, and said, "This is reasonable." And it was. The new terms asked for a formal seat on the Galactic Council, full trade rights, freedom of movement, recognition of all territorial and technological developments made during the isolation period, a joint committee to review the original incident that had caused the isolation and produce an honest historical record. That last one made several ambassadors uncomfortable. Vera watched them squirm and said nothing. She had waited 100 years. She could wait for them to read. Signing happened in waves. The first wave, 31 species, were the practical ones. They read the terms, they looked at the economic data attached in the appendix, they thought about trade access to a system that had spent a century building itself into something quite large, and they signed. Politics and commerce doing what they always did, pointing toward the obvious answer. The second wave came within a week. These were the more cautious species, the ones who had sent their legal teams back to the station archives to read the original treaty 6 more times, who had run economic modeling, who had consulted historians and diplomats, and anyone else they could find who might give them a reason to hesitate. The modeling all said the same thing. The historians all said the same thing. The diplomats, almost to a one, said the same thing. The Prothean ambassador Sela put it plainly in the internal council memo that later became something of a famous document in galactic political history. Whatever we imagined humanity would be after a century of isolation, they are more. The calculation is not complicated. Either we are part of the arrangement they are building, or we are outside it. Being outside, it will not be comfortable. 9 more species signed that week. 3 held out. The Mall Collective, whose amber and orange color shifts had been on anxious display throughout the summit, refused on the grounds that the Historical Review Committee was an unacceptable condition. They had, during the isolation period, done a considerable amount of business reselling goods that had been confiscated from human trade routes. The historical record was not something they wanted officially examined. The Rith Syndicate refused on principle. They refused most things on principle. It was practically their national identity. The Duhari Federation refused and did not explain why, which everyone understood to mean that they needed more time and were too proud to ask for it. Vera acknowledged all 3 refusals with a single line each. Noted, the offer remains open. That was all. No pressure, no follow-up delegation, no quiet threats passed through back channels. Just that line, delivered with the same tone as everything else she said, level, clear, and faintly permanent, like something carved into stone. The 3 holdouts watched and waited for the other shoe to drop. It didn't. Sorvith watched all of this from his position at the head of the council and tried to understand what he was seeing. He had spent 700 years studying power, how it was held, how it was used, how it was taken. He had seen many kinds of powerful figures sit at diplomatic tables, and every one of them in some way leaned forward. They pushed. They applied pressure, openly or quietly. They let you feel their weight in the room. Vera Solis did not lean forward. She was the most patient person Sorvith had ever met, and he had known people who lived for 3 centuries. She returned to the station each day with her leather briefcase and her one aide. She answered questions thoroughly and without irritation. She negotiated the finer points of the new terms with a precision that suggested she had rehearsed these conversations in her head for a very long time. She accepted small concessions gracefully and declined larger ones politely, and never, not once, gave the impression that any of this was urgent. It was not urgent for her. That was the thing he kept coming back to. She had 300 ships and a century of preparation, and a population number that nobody in this council wanted to say out loud. She had technology that matched or exceeded the galactic standard in key areas. She had, by any reasonable measurement, already won this negotiation before it began. And she sat in her chair like someone who had come to finish a task, not collect a prize. One afternoon between sessions, Sorvith found himself walking the same corridor as her aide, a young man named Saul, quiet, watchful, who seemed to have the same quality of stillness that his ambassador carried. Sorvith asked him, in a casual way that was not casual at all, how Ambassador Solis had prepared for this summit. Saul thought about it for a moment. She started preparing the day she was born, he said. They all did. He said it simply, without drama, the way a person states a plain fact. Then he nodded politely and continued down the corridor. Sorvith stood in the hallway for a moment. Then he went back to his office and wrote the first page of what would eventually become his memoirs. The Mall Collective requested a bilateral meeting 4 months after the summit ended. They signed at the bilateral. The Duhari Federation followed 3 months after that, once their internal politics had finished working through the decision at their own pace. The new terms included a small additional clause about a trade corridor that ran through their territory, favorable to them, quietly suggested by the human delegation in the bilateral meeting. And the Duhari signed with the careful dignity of people who had decided that they had, in fact, always intended to sign eventually. The Rith Syndicate held out for 11 months. Then they signed. They did not explain their change of position. Nobody asked. Vera Solis retired the following spring. There was a ceremony, a formal one, with all the correct procedures and appropriate speeches. She was given several titles in 3 different languages and 2 medals from council delegations who wanted to mark the occasion with something tangible. She thanked each delegation. She mispronounced 2 of the titles in a way that her aide was almost certain was deliberate. She left the medals on the table when she walked out, not rudely, just without particular interest, the way a person leaves behind something that was given in good faith but was never really the point. She went home to New Mexico. She had a house with a garden. She grew tomatoes and kept a small workshop in the back where she had started learning woodworking. Her great-great-grandmother had done woodworking. Vera had found the old tools in a family storage box years ago and kept them, for no reason she had ever explained to anyone, and she had always intended to learn. She was building a chair. It would take her 2 or 3 years to finish properly. She was not in a hurry. The galactic maps were redrawn in the months after the summit. The human sector, which had been pushed to the margins in the old maps, a small, isolated patch at the edge of trade routes, easy to ignore, easy to route around, was now in the center of 3 major corridors. Not because anyone had forced it there, because the infrastructure ran through it, because 100 years of building inside a closed system had produced ports and stations and fuel depots and manufacturing hubs that everyone, almost immediately, found very useful. Trade lanes shifted, not dramatically. Gradually, the way rivers shift, each individual change small, each one sensible on its own terms, the full picture only becoming clear from a distance. New partnerships formed. Old arrangements were renegotiated. Species that had never had much reason to interact with humanity found that they were now doing so regularly, because the routes that made the most sense happened to pass through human space. Nobody had planned it this way. Or perhaps somebody had. Sorvith finished his memoirs 2 years after the summit. The chapter about the day humanity returned was the shortest in the book. He had written it many times and kept cutting it down because everything he tried to say felt like too much or too little, and the truth of it was simpler than any of his attempts to explain it. He ended the chapter with 1 paragraph. We built the treaty to contain them. What we did not understand, what I do not think anyone could have understood without living through it, is that you cannot contain a species by cutting them off from the outside. You can only give them 100 years alone with themselves. And some species, given 100 years alone with themselves, discover things about what they are capable of, about what they owe and what they are owed, about how to wait. We gave them a wall. They used it as a foundation. I have thought about this for a long time, and I cannot find the moment we could have done differently. Perhaps there was no such moment. Perhaps that is the most honest thing I can say. He submitted the manuscript. His editor wanted to cut the last paragraph. He refused. In a house in New Mexico, in a small back workshop that smelled like sawdust and old wood, Vera Solis worked on her chair. She was 71 years old. Her hands were steady. The work was slow, which was fine. She had learned, a long time ago, or maybe it had been taught to her before she could walk, passed down through a family that had always known this specific thing, that slow work done correctly was worth more than fast work done carelessly. Outside her window, her tomatoes were coming in. Above her roof, 3 stars were visible on a clear night that she had looked up at since childhood, the edge of the galaxy, polite and distant and no longer quite so unreachable as it had once seemed. The chair would be finished when it was finished. She picked up her tools and went back to work.